Welcome to the Jordan Center. I'm Ann Ellsbury. I'm the chair of the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies, and we are extremely glad to welcome Susan Smith-Peter, who is our Jordan Center stalwart, and I want to get this right, Associate Professor of History at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York. I think we're probably all familiar with her work. Certainly it's been very important to me for a long time. She's the author of many articles on civil society and regional identity in Russia, and most recently the author of the book that's the topic of today's talk, Imagining Russian Regions, Subnational Identity and Civil Society in 19th-Century Russia. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Anne. I really appreciate you bringing me in. Thanks to Heather, thanks to Josh Tucker and Yanni Katsonis for all their work here at the Jordan Center. And it's really a wonderful pleasure for me to be here to commemorate, to celebrate the launch of my book. So thank you for joining me for that. So first off, I want to show you the cover, and then in the back you can also see the real thing and a small poster of it. This is the product of quite a few years of work, and it's a very New York cover too, because of course the picture is from New York Public Library. It just had to be because all of my work with them there. So let's start off by talking about what the book is about. So it's about civil society in Russia. And here I define it as a space between the state and family where people can take part in voluntary associations and other public activities. Now the question is, what is the importance of civil society? I mean, we can see here how I define it and what I mean by it, but how is it important? Well, in many ways, civil society is often seen as a means by which a country becomes modern, right? Becomes part of the modern world. Before a country has civil society, it's not seen as being completely modern. So this is part of that larger question which has been around in Russia for a long time, which is Russia part of the modern world? Is it a different subsection of the modern world? Or is it something completely different? Now, of course, my argument is that Russia is indeed part of the modern world, and this is something I've been arguing for a long time, and that, in fact, the whole debate about whether it is part of the modern world is part of the way the West has defined itself as against Russia. Part of the reason why the West has meaning as a concept is because it is contrasted to the East, and by the East, really, we're primarily talking about, when we talk about countries, we're talking about Russia. So civil society is part of that larger debate, and the stakes are pretty high, because if Russia is not really part of the modern world, then it is this kind of strange thing off on its own, you know, the enigma wrapped in the riddle and all that sort of stuff. So what I want to talk about is, well, first off, what is civil society in a historical sense, right? And what is it also in a grounded kind of sense, in the sense of what did civil society mean to people actually living their lives? So now, most people who are working on civil society today have come around more or less to this idea that 1861, the end of serfdom in Russia, was this moment when civil society emerged in Russia. So I'm not overturning that apple cart. I'm also saying that, but I'm saying too that when you begin at that moment, you don't really understand how that moment came to be. If you're always starting at a place, that place seems to be the determinant, when really it's the culmination of so many times and activities and individuals that were working towards that. Okay, so the provinces. The provinces in Russia are these places that have a tremendous amount of charge. That is to say, in Russia, when you talk about the provinces, you're usually not talking in a calm sort of manner. Usually there's something there where you are feeling angry or you need to feel that you are defending. Why? Because there is this sense that the provinces are something different, that the provinces are perhaps not authentic, or that they need to become more authentic, that they're empty, or some people who are arguing in favor of them say that they are indeed full of life. But it's not just kind of a normal, everyday kind of space that you talk about as just a place that everybody understands, that has a important significance within Russia. Instead, it is part of this whole terrain of anxiety. And I was recently reading Anne Lansbury's forthcoming book, and I was thinking that the title for it could actually be High Anxiety, because there's just so much anxiety over what the provinces are, what do they mean, does the emptiness, the quote-unquote emptiness of the provinces mean that there's nothing really there, and if there's nothing really there in 98% of Russia, does that mean there's nothing really there in Russia, period? Now, I'm actually looking at the provinces as a real place. There's actual land, and there are people, and there are crops, and there's soil, and it's not just a concept. And the provinces were really important because in the empire, in the Russian Empire before 1861, this was a place where the nobility and the other estates governed themselves at the provincial level. Now, of course, you've heard, I'm sure, that Russia was an autocracy, so that means one-man rule. But you've probably also heard that Russia is the largest country in the world, so the idea that one man could actually be ruling the whole thing is not really possible. And before 1861, there is a way of ruling that was very common to all empires, Roman empires, other empires, had done this, where it was more of a co-optation, where you co-opt groups that are on the ground and you work through them, you give them certain privileges and give them an elite status, and you work through them. And so the nobility, and there were other estates like the townspeople and the merchant estate, were doing some self-government on the ground. Now, so that means that the provinces are a space for political activity. The nation, or the empire, is not a space for political activity in the sense that we understand politics, a space for the putting forward of different claims and negotiation, because at the national level, the imperial level, it's supposed to be an autocracy where the emperor's word is the final say, whereas the provinces, you do have these discussions and these debates, if only at the estate level of the nobles, the townspeople, the merchants. Now, when you have the great reforms of the 1860s, and those include the end of serfdom, the reform of the judicial system, and a whole bunch of others that I'm not going to get into here, the political role of the provinces were up for a debate. There had been this more limited, but still real aspect of local self-government that had been going on. The great reforms start to bring that into question. Now, the old literature about civil society in Russia, we see here Antonio Gramsci wrote that civil society in Russia was primordial and gelatinous, and this is a photo of slime mold that I got. Wikimedia Commons, Wikimedia is misspelled. Okay, so, and that actually was cited with approbation for a long time until 1991. And in 1991, of course, it was collapse of the Soviet Union, and there is a search for predecessors, what came before, what was out there before all of this. And so then people started to move away from this idea, but it's still significant to understand that when we're talking about, several decades ago, that this was a relatively common idea. Nikolai Gogol, and of course with Anne here, in Dead Souls, presented the provinces as empty and inauthentic space. And this is an interesting thing here because we have a picture of stamps that were recently emitted from Russia. And if you look at it closely, you will see that there are pictures of St. Petersburg in the background, and there's a picture of a village, but there's not really a picture of the provinces. So here we have an example in present day of the provinces as a blank. You know, some of these stamps, you know, we do see some provincial topics because of the nature of the work, but in terms of architecture that would actually stand for the provinces, we don't really have that. So one of the things that I argue about Gogol is that, in addition to, of course, being fiction, which means that it's not true, right? So that's important to understand that when something is fiction, it can't be just sort of mined for data, that it is a creation that is the vision of a person, but is not the same as a reflection of reality, whatever that is. But Gogol was also responding to things that were going on at the time. And I'll talk about some of those later. Like, for example, Provincial Identity was being created, and that was the work of non-nobles. That's part of the reason why he did not like the provincial town that much. And nobles were creating a new estate identity, a district identity. So the district is smaller than the province. It's sort of about the same size as our county. So he was responding to things that were going on in the world around him. So that second book of Dead Souls was also a response to this larger development of district identity, which I'll talk more about later. Okay. So for many years, the provinces were seen as empty spaces, lacking intellectual content, but providing raw material for social history. As you see, this space is intentionally left blank. So when you mine something for data, you are kind of making an argument that there's not meaning there. There's just items, and there's things that could be put into a table, there's things that could be tabulated or counted, but not necessarily understood or brought into some kind of intellectual content. Now, there's newer work that shows that the provinces did have self-awareness, and we also have in the audience Catherine Eftehoff, and this is the photograph that is used on the cover of her book. I really couldn't find anything better. I think this is the perfect one because this is the photographer Karelin, and he is taking a picture overlooking the Nizhny Novgorod exhibition of the late 19th century. So here we have these people overlooking the exhibition, which is put together to make the provinces visible, to make them visible to themselves and to the center, and to give a sense of being part of the whole. So there is this sense of provincial self-awareness, but many of the people who are taking part in this provincial self-awareness are people who are working in the provinces. Makes sense, right? So if you believe that the provinces don't have the capacity to generate meaning, you might not look for them there. But these newer works, of which I am a part, have been arguing, and I think very strongly and very well, that the provinces did have self-awareness and that they were places full of meaning, even if people at the center didn't necessarily want to grant them that meaning. Now, in the historiography of civil society, optimists argued that the rise of voluntary associations, especially after 1861, showed the vitality of late imperial civil society. And here we have the book cover of Brad Bradley's book, Voluntary Associations in Tsarist Russia. And if you take a look at the picture, you'll see that the people there are probably not poor. We can stay with that. They're probably not poor. I don't remember which society this is, but it is one of the voluntary societies, and they are meeting together. And there were a great many voluntary societies. And voluntary societies and associations, these have been seen as the core of what civil society is, really since Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about them in Democracy in America. And he talked about the significance of these voluntary associations where people are coming together without any forced nature. They are deciding themselves that they are going to do this thing and to change the society in which they live. And absolutely, there were a great many voluntary associations after 1861, and before there were more than were known about, and I'll talk more about that later. So when you focus on voluntary associations, the picture looks pretty good. It looks pretty upbeat, and there are more and more being founded the whole time, and that looks great. Now, pessimists argued that civil society saw the peasants as separate, and that led to a poorly knit body politic. Now, these are wooden spoons. Why are there wooden spoons in there? Because Laura Engelstein has written this famous work about how the peasants were seen as so different and almost a different kind of species of human being because they used the wooden spoon, and the wooden spoon spread syphilis. And so that's why I have the pictures of the wooden spoon there. When you look at peasants and how peasants are integrated into the system, the situation doesn't look quite as good as when you're looking at voluntary associations. Now, I'll come back to peasants later. I do want to make sure that everybody understands I'm not blaming this on peasants. Peasants were rational actors, I believe, but they were working within a system that kept them separate in many ways because of romanticism, and we'll talk more about that later. But when 85% minimum of your body politic is kind of separate, it's a problem. It is a problem. How you're going to overcome that is something that's not always completely clear. Another thing that I really argue is that in the years before the Great Reform, so this is before 1861, the state created a civil society capable of being a partner, and then it rejected that civil society. There's a lot of ironies here because Catherine the Great, one of her hopes is that there could be some kind of partner, that she could reach out to a society that would be capable of responding, that there would be more educated people out there who could tell her what was out there in the provinces. And over time, due to institutions that she and Nicholas I created, that did start to come about. Then Alexander II, and even more Alexander III and Nicholas II, they went the opposite direction and rejected that civil society. So that is also the story of Frankenstein. Now, I'm not saying that civil society was the same as Frankenstein. It wasn't a Frankenstein monster. But as I was thinking about this dynamic of where you create something, you give it life, and then you reject it, and you don't want to work with it very well. There is something of this pathos that I find there, especially in the reactions of many of the people who had been working for the state as individual citizens up until around 1861. There is this fear, and this is among the nobles in particular, there is this fear that now the nobles aren't needed anymore, that now the nobles don't have a place in society, and that perhaps they could be excluded from society completely. And the fear was not without grounds, unfortunately. So what started this? Was it because the state was like, we're warm and fuzzy, we want to make people happy? No, really, it was because they needed information from the regions. Why did they need information from the regions? Well, you can't really tax very well if you don't have information. If you don't know how many factories are out there, how can you tax factories? If you don't know how many villages are out there, how can you tax villages? So they really needed information, and they didn't have enough bureaucrats to be able to collect all of that information themselves. So there had to be a co-optation of elites or regional educated people. And so one of the things that they did is they created institutions to discover the province. This is especially true under Nicholas I. Under Nicholas I, and we'll talk about this more later, there were a series of long-lasting institutions that were created to discover the province. Now, the state did not then intend that people would have a sense of provincial identity. That was an unintended consequence. Instead, they thought that they would get more information, and the information would be useful, and that's what they were hoping for. But unintended consequences do arise. And once you have a sense of belonging to the province, then you can make an argument that since I belong to the province, I ought to be able to represent the province politically. Or at the very least, I ought to be able to tell the government what the needs of the province are. And that's something you see again and again. Because the autocrat was supposed to be able to make all these decisions, you didn't have an automatic right to speak to the autocrat or to speak in public. But if you said, I understand the needs of the province, and I can help the state, I can help the autocrat better understand what those needs are, then all of a sudden you have some kind of ground to which to, to refer to and to stand on. So pulling back a little bit, to the 17th century, the Russian North and Siberia expressed a mystical regionalism. Now this wonderful map is from Valery Kivelson's work, Cartographies of Serfdom, and it's by Semyon Remizov, and he's a wonderful, fascinating guy. I've written about him. It was published in Siberia, so it was very authentic. So Remizov, he wrote about Siberia, and he wrote about Tobolsk. And you may not know this, but Tobolsk, which is in Siberia, is the center of the universe, okay? According to Remizov, right? Why? Because it is, you can see it here, presented in a similar way to how Jerusalem is presented. The concentric circles, and it is its own center. So this is not a neurotic or anxious kind of provincialism. This is a sense of being one's own center. Now, he wasn't rejecting the fact that it was part of a larger empire. I mean, partly he did this because he was asked to do so by Tsar Alexei. And so as a result, there's this sense that he is part of the whole. But within that whole, Tobolsk is its own center. And in some ways, you can see it going beyond just saying its own center, but its own true, this is the true holy place, is Tobolsk. And I've written about this in that article, as I mentioned, and it's fascinating because he and one of the governors that was sent there to Tobolsk, they were putting together a whole series, because Remizov, in addition to being a cartographer, was also an architect. They were putting together a whole series of buildings that were making claims to Tobolsk being a New Jerusalem. Right? So there was a special gate that would be similar to the gate in Jerusalem. And for this, Peter the Great, because he was already Tsar by that time, had that governor killed. So that was something, the result of it is that this regionalism possibly had political aspects to it, aspects that were concerning enough to Peter the Great that he took more extreme action. But mystical regionalism is also in the Russian North too, not just in Siberia, and that is the sense that the region is a series of holy places and springs and local saints, and that there are local pilgrimages, and the whole thing is a densely woven network of local holy places that one could walk and take part in and connect to this kind of timeless time, as it were. This time outside of time, but not in a negative sense, as comes up later in the 19th century, but rather in this mystical sense of you're touching the eternal, as it were. Now, very differently, in the 18th century, Enlightenment regionalism saw regions as interchangeable, like these playing cards. And I was very glad to find these playing cards that the New York Public Library had. These were among the last things that were bought by the Slavic and Baltic division. So these cards are very telling, because here you have the coat of arms of each region, you have their status within the deck of cards, and then you have the typical dress of one of the people, one of the persons in the region, like Kazan over here, you know, this is one of the nationalities, and then Tver and Kiev, here we have more traditional peasant kind of clothing. So you see all these things together in a relatively compact form, but there's not a sense of a network or any of these being a sacred center. Instead, they're all interchangeable. Some of them might have more value within the playing cards, but there is definitely a sense of all the same level. Okay. Now, the book focuses on Vladimir Province. Why? Because it was the site of agrarian and industrial economic development, and also an articulation of provincial identity from the 1830s on. I didn't want to choose a place like Siberia or the Russian North that had pre-existing forms of regional identity. I wanted to choose a place that really didn't have other forms of regional identity, because I wanted to see what was it that started to create, what was it that started to emerge from this time. And here we can see the map of the province. And also I'll note that those sub-units are districts within the province. So when we talk later about districts, you can see the ones that are outlined in color, that each of those outlined in color is a district. Okay. In the 1830s, the government created these institutions to study the province in order to stimulate a Smithian civil society. So we'll unpack that a little bit more. Nicholas I was influenced by Adam Smith, right? So Adam Smith had quite a bit of influence, actually. Catherine the Great was influenced by him, and Nicholas I was as well, because Nicholas had a tutor that was Smithian. Nicholas chose a Smithian tutor for his son, who would become Nicholas II, the person who abolished serfdom. And that's important too, because of course Smith had argued that free labor is much better than slave labor, and so that was important for forming Alexander II's ideas. So this moment in the 1830s is what I call the era of small reforms. And Smithian civil society is somewhat different from what we think of when we think of civil society. Smithian civil society is about moving from the stage of feudalism, what we would now call feudalism, which is agrarian, where you have nobles that are in charge, moving to a civil or commercial society. And the civil or commercial society is a society in which people trade, they get involved with buying and selling. It's also civil in that people have better manners than they did before. And that's important too, because it's bad for business if people are constantly fighting each other, and you want to have more polished manners and more calm sort of way of doing things. Now, the government wants civil society. In some ways, it wants more the commercial society, because, of course, if you have commercial society, then people are buying and selling more things. And if they're buying and selling more things, then the state can tax more. So it makes a lot of sense why they would want that. So Nicholas I and people underneath him they were creating provincial newspapers and statistical committees. So the idea was that if people can see what other people are doing through the newspapers, through joining the statistical committees, they will, compete with each other. And as a result, the economy will do better. Again, the idea of stimulating provincial identity was not at all part of the government's plan, but that is what happened. And so this period is really important for understanding what happened in the 1860s and after, because it's from this moment where we get the articulation of a new kind of provincial identity. So going back to this idea of Adam Smith. So Adam Smith says all societies have to move from that agrarian stage to the civil or commercial society. Now this is from a Manhattan picture collection. It's 18th century English and Scottish dress. Smith himself, as others have argued, was a provincial intellectual. So he was working from the periphery, as it were, periphery of Scotland. And from his point of view, the lowlands of Scotland, which were more polished and more English in their way of acting, was a higher stage than the highlands of Scotland. And so here we have that actually put out in a visual format, that the English way of acting is literally put higher than the traditional Scottish Highlander kind of way. The Scottish Highlander, more agrarian, more feudal, that is to say people were swearing fealty to those above them. It's more militaristic. We see a more kind of ready for war society below, whereas the people above, they are not ready for war. They seem to be about to dance or something like that. So we have more polished manners, and those more polished manners are very important for the creation of a commercial society, as I said before. So Nicholas, the government and Nicholas himself, they wanted the benefits of Smith's commercial society and so accepted the development of Smithian civil society, but some of those implications made it uncomfortable. Because if you're going to be arguing that you're going from one stage to another, one can make the argument that part of that civil society ought to include political representation. Now that argument doesn't get made so much in the 1830s, but it does get made in the 1860s. I'm putting together a picture, with this of the 1896 Nizhny Novgorod All-Russian Artistic and Industrial Exhibition. It's later than this period, but it's actually a perfect example of the idea that emerges from the 1830s, which is, let us find out the wealth of provinces. What are the wealth of provinces? So one of the ways they would exhibit this is by putting together exhibits of the production. What was actually being produced? What kind of linen was being produced? What kind of cotton was being produced? Was there anything that was made in iron? Any kind of tools or artisan or any sort of other kind of work? And that way of presenting the province actually was profoundly influential. And of course it was in many ways agreeable to the Soviets, because when we're talking about production and showing off the production of what was going on in the provinces, that is something that does seem to chime well with what the provinces, with what the Soviets wanted to do with the provinces. So this is something that is quite long-lasting there. All right, so the provincial public that starts to emerge from this whole process that Nicholas I puts together, this era of small reforms, is non-noble, and it's mainly merchants and priests' sons. Here we have two watercolors of Fyodor Solontzev's The Clothing of the Russian State, which is an amazing set of watercolors which have not been published. They're at the New York Public Library, really extraordinary material. And on the left we have a Tver merchant wearing traditional kind of merchant garb, and on the right we have a priest. So merchants were very interested, especially merchants who were old believers. So old believers are those people who are who did not accept the reforms of 1666, the unfortunately timed reforms of 1666. They saw those reforms in the church liturgy as wrong and part of the devil, and so they refused to accept those reforms. And one of the things that happened as a result of that is that they needed to be able to have literacy, because some of them had no priests, other old believers did have priests, but there weren't that many priests. And if they wanted to be able to conduct a liturgy as they saw fit, they needed to be literate in order to do so. So these merchants who were old believers or suspected old believers were very active in this new provincial public. And priests' sons, they of course were literate. I mean, that was part of being a priest, or certainly the hope was that the priests would be literate, and many of them went into the bureaucracy. So the non-nobles are creating their own sense of identity, and so the nobles, in response, start to have their own sense, which is a district identity. So this is just a snapshot of one part of the district, one part of that provincial map that we saw before. And we can see here, it's the outline in green, and you can see Shuya, which is one of the places that I talk about. It's an older town, but it is also an industrial town in Vladimir province. So the nobles feel like the district is the place where they can say, this is the true Russia. And it's also the place where the nobles had more power, because in 1837, the government had put in a new law that gave the governor more power at the level of the provincial town. And when the governor got more power, it meant that the nobles got less power. But at the district, the nobles still had the same power, so it does make sense for them to kind of pull back, as it were, and to focus on the district as a space for them to work in. They saw their estates as places where they could establish market agriculture through voluntary associations. And here we see this bronze medal from the Moscow Agricultural Society. The Moscow Agricultural Society was a very important society for my book. It is a society where the nobles got together and really worked hard to try to introduce market agriculture. So they didn't want to have traditional kind of subsistence level agriculture. Instead, they wanted to be able to sell crops, to make more money, to perhaps not just use the three-field system, but other systems that were more productive. Now, they were influenced by the German reception of Adam Smith's stages as potentially including a transition to a higher agricultural stage rather than an industrial one. So in Germany, the reception of Smith was a little bit different. It wasn't so much a celebration of industry as trying to figure out what of Smith could be adapted so that you could have more agrarian sort of system that was more productive. And here we have Albert Thayer. Thayer was a very important German agronomist and a doctor. George III of England actually asked Thayer if he would be his personal doctor, but Thayer said no. Now, George III was also known as Farmer George, so he was also aware of Thayer's work in agriculture. So Thayer is interested in new kinds of agriculture, new crops, new tools, new techniques, and in general moving away from the older agriculture. And of course the hope was that they could make more money. But also they hoped that they could avoid the creation of proletarians and an industrial Russia. That was one of their main hopes. Of course, it didn't happen. We can see that here by this very interesting poster, Proletarian, Don't Fear Heavy Artillery, that came from the New York Public Library. And the nobles at that time were writing a lot about proletarians. They were using that term. They weren't using the term proletariat, no. But proletarians, yes. There was definitely this fear that if industry was allowed to grow, that the peasants would become alienated from the land, that they would become no longer truly Russian, and that they would potentially become revolutionary. Pretty much, yes. So they did see that fear. And instead they wanted this rural Russia with improved agricultural techniques where the nobles would teach the peasants. And this is connected to a much longer history of the sense that the village is the true Russia, that the peasants are the true Russians. This print we have here is from 1887. Even though it's later, it does give that feeling of being part of something authentic and rooted and agrarian and true. And of course, that's all influenced by Romanticism as well. And so that's what they wanted. You know, not this. This is their nightmare. This is their nightmare. The red factory stacks and the boom and all of the stuff. And this is what they want instead. There's a completely different vision. Now, they also saw the peasants as incapable of living their life without noble oversight. I've chosen the peasants of Yaroslavl province here particularly because Yaroslavl is a very fascinating place. It is connected to the creation of what we think of as the peasant commune. Because Haxhausen, who was a German theoretician, author, writer, he went to Yaroslavl and he spoke to some of the noblemen there, including the president of the Yaroslavl Agricultural Society, who was the one who told Haxhausen about the peasant commune. And Haxhausen was wanting to find some new institution on which to base society, something that was authentic and true and real and organic and not alienated. That sounds a lot like German Romanticism. Well, yeah, pretty much. But the funny thing is that the actual peasants of the actual president of the Yaroslavl Agricultural Society were very engaged with the market. They were selling their linen, and they were very much part of this emerging market system and market agriculture. The nobles, however, write a lot, especially during this time, about how the peasants have to be taught how to do everything. They have to be taught how to make shi and kasha, right? So that's cabbage soup and buckwheat groats, which are the absolute staples of peasant life and cuisine. So if you have to teach them to do that level, it means you have to teach them to do absolutely everything, which is certainly problematic. Now, of course, if you do need to teach them to do all that, it means the nobles have a role in society. So it's not just about putting the peasants down, but also about lifting the nobles up. So from the 1840s, though, we get this spread of Hegel's ideas, and that changed some Russian nobles' views of the peasants. So this is G.W.F. Hegel, obviously the German philosopher. And the vector of influence of Hegel's ideas was definitely Moscow University. So students learned about Hegel's idea of civil society as separate from the state and the family. Remember before, we're talking about Adam Smith. Civil society was a stage. It was a stage. It wasn't a kind of schemata. Here, we first get the understanding of civil society as something that's different from the state, that's different from the family. And what Hegel said is that private property was linked to freedom. So the idea is that you make more money, then you invest it in property. And if the property has some kind of foundation and it can't be taken away randomly by the state, then one could have a separate basis on which to live. But if there is no private property or property rights, then the state could take property from people, and then as a result there's no real grounding for freedom. So property is very crucial to Hegel's idea of freedom and of civil society. And the nobles that are influenced by this from 1840s on are arguing that what you really need is a universal category of property owners. So you would have former masters and former serfs, and by bringing them together as property owners, they would be able to unite. And so therefore, all those fears about proletarians, and would there be a revolution, if they're both property owners, then they could come together as one, or if not as one, with the nobles in the lead. The Hegelians really wanted serfdom to end, and they asked the state to do so. It makes sense. If you want the serfs to have private property, you're definitely going to have to end serfdom, because serfdom means serfs are property. I mean, you can't own property if you are property yourself. So for them, ending serfdom is absolutely crucial to the whole project. And it was a lot harder for these Hegelians to work with the state than the Smithians had. The Hegelians had more political demands. The Smithians, in many ways, their project was very congenial to the state, because the Smithians wanted to learn more about the economy, and the state wanted to learn more about the economy. They were both interested in moving things forward, whereas the Hegelians were saying, no, we need to have this larger system, a system of property rights, and as property rights are a ground of freedom, then oftentimes it's connected to political demands. And this is based on Hegel. He'd said there'd be, you need to have some kind of representation to protect private property. Otherwise, it could be taken away by the state. So out of this, we get this sort of synthesis, right? The thesis was the provincial identity. The antithesis was the district identity, and then we get this synthesis of a multi-estate provincial identity. So that means that nobles are reaching out to merchants and clergy. And those merchants and clergy have earlier been part of that non-noble provincial identity. And they were reaching out because they understood that serfdom was going to have to end. And the merchants already had to pay people wages, right? Because they were not serf owners. So they had to pay people wages. Even if the people they were paying those wages to were serfs, they still had to pay wages in order to have those people working for them. So the nobles, the ones especially who are Hegelian, the ones who especially understand that serfdom is going to have to end, not just for the state's needs, but for the needs of the nobility themselves, they start to realize, okay, let's get ahead of the curve. Let's start figuring out how free labor has been implemented by other groups. And so you start to have this new kind of non-noble provincial identity. And that's quite different from the way it was before, because earlier the nobles and the non-nobles had separate groups. They had separate systems of sociability. They were mainly meeting in different places. And so by the late 1850s, you do have something different going on where those nobles and non-nobles are more coming together. So after the Crimean War, 1853 to 56, which was certainly a trauma because Britain defeated Russia, Russian state decided to begin the process to abolish serfdom. And here we have Alexander II in the print collection at New York Public Library. Alexander II did play a very important role here, absolutely, without a doubt. And as I mentioned before, his tutor, he had this Smithian tutor, Konstantin Arsenyev, And that was definitely an influence on him, because Arsenyev was a statistician who really spent the bulk of his life arguing that serfdom had to go, that it was inconsistent with Russia's great power status, that it was making Russia backward, and that it was absolutely a problem and had to go. And then, of course, the Crimean War really shows that there's some basis to that. So what happens here is the state kind of does a switch. At first, the state is very open to asking provincial nobles to provide information about the province. And that makes sense, because remember, before, the state had been reaching out to all sorts of groups. It was co-opting groups. It was asking people to send in information. And so at the beginning of the reform process, there's sort of a continuation of that. They asked the nobles to perform these, to create these provincial committees on the peasant question. But then the state, in 1858, they shifted towards centralization. Now, that also makes sense, because in the end, the state was an autocracy. There were people who felt that the nobles maybe were going to go too far, and individuals within the bureaucracy were able to say, look, in the end, the autocrat has to make the decision, and we can't allow the nobles to be making these kinds of decisions. So Hegelians, who had kind of been brought into the whole process and told that they were going to have a major role in deciding how things were going to happen, now all of a sudden they get shut out. And they become very sharply critical of the government. And the Hegelians, too, they can actually understand what's going on, because remember, Hegel said that civil society was between the state and the family. So for them, conceptually, it makes sense. They can start thinking of themselves as, we are civil society, we are separate from the state, and therefore we can be opposed to the state. Whereas, under Smith, there really wasn't that sense of being separate. It was more that everybody was together, there was a stage of history, and they needed to go to another stage. Now, Hegelians were very against the idea that peasants should be in separate institutions after abolition, because Hegelians, really the core of the belief here is that there should be a common identity, a shared identity as property owners. Former serfs and former masters should both have a shared identity as property owners, and then that shared identity would form kind of the basis for everything moving forward. But the Russian state, blinded by Romanticism, believed that the peasants would always be a bulwark of the dynasty and sought to keep them separate. Now, this is a wonderful visualization of that. This is Alexander II. He is the one there standing there. You can see that the peasants are all smaller than him. They're all together kind of in a wall, almost like a foundation. And you don't get the sense that any of them are there as individuals. They're there as a mass. And they're all looking up lovingly, reverentially at the Tsar, who is enthroned, but there's almost an element here of worship as well. And so this is a good example of this romanticization of the peasantry as this separate world that was always going to be in favor of the monarchy. So now we have the liberals, the Hegelians. They had been rejected by the government. They kept on arguing, though. They kept on saying, look, we have this local knowledge. We can serve the state. We can help you out. We can tell you about information. Don't you want to learn about this? And these liberals included very important Slavophiles. So these are liberal Slavophiles, like Koshelov, who was active in the Lebedean and Moscow agricultural societies. So that's a picture of him there. A lot of the work that's been done on Slavophiles has focused more on the conservative Slavophiles than on the liberal Slavophiles. I mean, there has been work on the liberal Slavophiles, but in comparison, it's not as much. And the Lebedean and Moscow agricultural societies are a vast and completely untapped archival resource for the history of Slavophiles. I've found a fascinating debate in which sort of the top names of liberal Slavophiles are all debating about everything involving the end of serfdom and what needs to be done, and it's unpublished, and basically none of the stuff from those archival fundi are published at all. So it would be a wonderful thing for others to work in. Koshelov, he was the head of the Moscow Agricultural Society, and he used it as a base for a continuing noble opposition even after the state took control of the process. So this is the Moscow Agricultural Society's Agricultural Academy. Now, people have written about the noble opposition, people have written about Koshelov. Certainly this is not something that's new, but the fact that he used the Moscow Agricultural Society as his base, because he was the president of it, because he had institutional means, that part has not been looked at. And so again, our understanding of the noble opposition is really quite incomplete, because there are these massive, I mean truly massive, files in the Moscow Agricultural Society's archives that have not been worked through. So what happens? The liberals protest, but the state decides what it's going to do without, necessarily taking into account what they were saying. So peasants were given separate institutions at the sub-district level, and over time that gave them the sense of belonging to a body politic in which the nobility and the merchantry had very little, if any, role. So these were functioning institutions. The peasants were very active, they were behaving rationally, but in their life, in their political life as it were, in being part of a community, that community was a community of workers and peasants and Cossacks, which is sort of similar to how the Bolsheviks were going to define their body politic. So when the peasants came around to hearing that, it made sense, because that had been congruent with their long-term experience. And that's part of the consequences for Russian history. Now the nobles complained about this, and the liberal nobles, and they talked about the problems of it, but the state really did believe that, hey, the peasantry is going to be of this bulwark, that they are going to be supporting us. So they didn't take seriously the claims, the problems that might emerge. So we have the end of serfdom, and we have the great reforms, and this is a moment where civil society took shape. But it's a civil society that is emerging within an institutional structure that is not very integrated. And that structure, in particular, the peasants are not well integrated. They are integrated into their own institutions, but if the idea is to integrate the peasants into larger institutions, that part is very much less done. So what you have here, again, is you get this multi-estate provincial civil society that emerges. And here we have the nobles, as well as the merchants and the priests' sons and the people who had been involved in all those different stages. But when they make these political claims to speak for the province, the state rejected them. And in addition, it's important to understand that civil society, as it was conceived in Russia at the time, sought to have a harmonious society, And that sounds great. I mean, who among us would not want to have a harmonious society? But there's certain problems when you want a harmonious society, because there are people who don't agree. And when those people don't agree, and you believe that there ought to be a harmonious society, you could say, well, those people are the problem. And you see this even at the moment of this articulation of civil society. And I talk about this in my book, where the Vladimir nobles, at the same time they're saying, the state ought to listen to us, you're silencing us, this is terrible. They also are silencing critics of the nobility because there's this sense of we all have to be on the same page, and you don't get this feeling that there should be debate and dissension. And so as a result, there is also a problem within civil society itself. So implications. Now we're looking at the big picture. It's really an applied intellectual history. This is one of the things I really am trying to do, and this is partly a reaction to how the provinces have been seen as sort of this mine of raw data, but not as an arena of thought. It is applied intellectual history in that we see how these ideas were put into practice in the provinces and how those ideas came to life and how the people received them and then changed things. And when you take the Great Reforms as the starting point, you don't understand really how much the earlier part shapes them. And the Great Reforms are a tremendously important starting point, but it's also an ending point too. It's an ending of a particular era, and we need to understand the ending as well as we understand the beginning. And I also argue that without the era of small reforms, we can't really understand the era of great reforms. And of course, the era of small reforms, that was 1830s, Nicholas I, the provincial institutions. So reforms codify civil society in this way that there's these divisions, deep divisions between it and the population, the main population being the peasants, and the state. And when World War I came, the state and society were simply too weak to hold together. And that test of World War I was a great test, and many of the empires in Europe were swept away by it, and Russia was one of them. Now, it's hard to know for sure if the Great Reforms had been different, if they would have been able to survive the test of World War I, but there is a connection here between the divisions in the body politic that were institutionalized after World War I and the inability of the state to stand up to that great test of World War I. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to let Susan field her own questions. Does that work?
That's fine.
Okay, great. Thanks.
When you talk about civil society, you're putting it in a political context, right? Because there was civil society in a cultural aspect. You know, there were the salons, and there were groups, you know, of poets and writers. So that's not what you mean by civic society.
Yeah, it's not what I'm focusing on here. One of the things I wanted to do when I was talking about civil society is I wanted to really focus on the historical aspect of civil society, because it's always a tension when we're talking about civil society, because you have the historical thing and then you've got the normative thing. So the normative thing is this is the way it ought to be, and Russia is not, you know, meeting that standard, as it were. One can do that, one can make that argument, but I didn't really want to do that. It seems almost too easy. Instead, I want to talk about, well, what kind of ideas of civil society were present on the ground and how were they used. So that's why I'm focusing on these concepts, the Smithian and also the Hegelian, because those were the ideas of civil society that motivated people and that led to the creation of things that we see as civil society. So yeah, I'm not denying that there's these other things like salons and so on and so forth are part of civil society, because oftentimes those connections between salons and voluntary associations are really quite close, and sometimes salons would kind of give themselves a name, not necessarily register, but they would quasi be voluntary associations as well. So yes, it's not about saying that it's not civil society, but more saying that I'm focusing on these other regions. And not always has to be political. In the Hegelian part, it's definitely political. The Smithian part is less political because that is part of the nature of how Smith defined civil society. I mean, it's political in the sense that there's a body, it's a empire, and the life of the empire is political in this kind of general sort of sense, but it's not political in the sense that people are making demands for representation. That really comes in Hegel's political power. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. But thanks for that question. That's a good question. Mm-hmm.
The emperor was an autocrat,
Mm-hmm.
and Stalin was also an autocrat.
Mm.
So if the provinces were open for spaces open for political activity under the Tsar, was that the case under Stalin, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually recently published an article that talks about the 6 waves of European regionalism. And in this, I argue that there are 6 waves of European regionalism that take place in 1830, 1860, 1890, 1920s, 1970s, and the 2000s. So these are sort of generationally recurring things. And when you look at the history of regionalism, here more defined in a political sense as well as in a cultural sense. Cultural regionalism is sort of like, hey, we've got these different costumes and we have folk songs and we're going to get together and we're going to celebrate that. Political regionalism is saying we ought to have representation, we're a region, we have needs. So in terms of both cultural and political regionalism, Russia was with or ahead of Western Europe up until the 1920s. And then, under Stalin, there's a massive divergence. And after Stalin, by the 1970s, Russian regionalism has been returned to the state it was in the 1830s. And in Western Europe, it had very much surged on to a lot of representation, a lot of demands. The European Union is very important here. So people have written about sort of regions, regionalism under Stalin. And if you're looking at activity at the local level, you can sort of make an argument that regions are making claims to economic development, for example. That's another article I've written about. But when you look at claims for political regionalism, it really is not there. It really is not there. And so it all depends on how you define it. I mean, if you define it as regionalism as an economic jockeying for resources to be sent to your region, you could say, okay, right, there is something of that going on with Stalin. But in terms of a regionalism that's more broadly understood to be a regionalism, no, you don't really see it there. And the divergence of the 1970s really makes that clear. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for the talk. It was, I mean, I've been following this book for a long time, and it's really wonderful to see it all put together. And to me, it's convincing, and it's convincing because, you know, partly because I've followed your work as you've put it all together, and I'm just curious, as a non-historian, I'm curious about what kind of pushback you get against your arguments. Like, are there, you know, among other historians, are there people who say, oh, but this, oh, but it doesn't fit with my view of X?
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll see. I haven't got all the reviews. I haven't really any reviews yet, so we'll find out. A lot of like pushback I got was more just feedback for earlier stages. People saying, well, what about Gogol? That's part of the reason why Gogol plays such a big role in here.
Even historians would say
Oh yeah,
that too.
oh yeah,
Really?
definitely.
Huh.
Oh yeah, definitely. So as a result, I really kind of had to integrate Gogol into the story and kind of make him part of the evidence, because yes, that has come up. Well, don't we already know?
That's insane.
Don't we already know about the provinces because we read Gogol? It's like saying, well, don't we already know about the South in the United States because we read Faulkner? No.
Or Gone with the Wind.
Or Gone with the Wind, right? Yeah. I mean, why set the Civil War? We have Gone with the Wind. So, so that's part of it. One sort of smaller debate that I have seen have been, there are people like Alexander Kaminsky. He writes very interesting work on provincial history, but he does it from a much more social demographic kind of way. I really like to work in a biographical kind of way. I like to look at the affiliation of ideas, where ideas come down, where people study, who is influenced by who. But you can look at provincial history through a much more demographic, kind of classic social history kind of way, where you're working on, let's just say, legal documents, trials, and that sort of thing. So if you want to look at networks in that more putting things in tables kind of way, my work is not that. I mean, I'm just not a putting things in tables kind of historian. And I'm not saying the tables are bad. I'm just saying that it's not me. So if if you want that other kind of provincial history, then one can do that, because there is much to be learned, and there's a lot we don't learn, we don't know yet about what was going on in the provinces and all that kind of physicality and broader networks and all of that. So some people have said, well, what about that kind of provincial history? To which I have to say, no, let 1,000 flowers bloom, or 2 or 3 at the very least. So yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, I'm curious to see what the reviews will be. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sort of following on that, actually, I was noticing that you don't use the sort of very popular, until recently, empire framework of center and periphery, or say orientalizing, that kind of language, and I wondered if that was sort of you're consciously setting that aside, or what you think of that language.
You know, I started by using center and periphery and that sort of thing. I'm just not sure that it's that helpful, because when you start talking about center and periphery, then you have to start talking about, well, what kind of periphery? Are we talking about the Caucasus? Are we talking about European Russia? And you could say, well, is European Russia really a periphery? The Western provinces seem more like a periphery. So once you have to start explaining the terms to that degree, it seemed to be easier to me to go back to terms that were used at the time. And so that's why it's a really deeply historical look at it, because I'm using the terms that were used at the time. Of course, with an understanding of how we understand civil society today, for example. But I'm trying to avoid kind of an overlay. That's why I don't use public sphere, for example, because public sphere is in some ways similar in that there's such a normative aspect to public sphere. I started out using it, but then I just realized the normative part of it was so large that I had to have so much explanation that I started feeling that it might just make more sense not to use it at all, and instead to use these historical terms. And in some ways, too, when we're looking at center and periphery, it makes sense to be taking a more kind of state's eye or God's eye view of the whole. And I'm trying to figure out what was going on in particular provinces, which I don't really see as peripheries. I mean, when you can get to Vladimir by, in less than a day at the time, or just 3 hours today, is that a periphery when going on the Trans-Siberian is 12 to 13 days? I mean, I'm not convinced. But I definitely can see other questions that might be profitably gotten to by asking what core and periphery, how that could help one frame one's research there. Yeah.
Another language
Yeah.
one. I noticed in the introduction of the book, I love your Frankenstein thing. And here I think you had said that they create and then reject the provincial identity. And then in the introduction, I think you said they fathered and then rejected, which made me think of it, because I hadn't thought of Frankenstein, that's brilliant, but I was thinking of it more of an abusive relationship. And whether you would, in that frame, think of the provinces as the victim of the state.
It's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, the victim of the state, but in the weird sense that they're also created by the state, which I guess would be a familial kind of thing. Because you can draw lines on a map, but that doesn't mean that the people inside those lines know about those lines, care about those lines, or feel that it's important to them. I mean, things that don't seem to have meaning can be invested with meaning. For example, the area code 212. Does it have any real meaning? No, but it is definitely more prestigious than other area codes, right? Because we have given meaning to it, because it has meaning within it. So that the shape of the province is not enough. Something has to be made from it. Some understanding has to come from it. And that really wasn't there before. I mean, and that is different from Siberia and the Russian North. I mean, Siberia and the Russian North have this long, complicated history of relations with the state that I'm not going into here, although I mention it somewhat in the book. So one can't easily say that they were, fathered by the state in the same way. Even though when you look at the really long history of it, there, of course, is very much state involvement. But yeah, I mean, there is a bit of that. It's a bit of that. And it's hard because one has to, as the provinces, differentiate from the state to have a sense of identity. But then if one is rejected and told, well, those things that you used to be able to advise us on before, your local knowledge, no longer are going to be enough, yeah, perhaps there is something a little bit abusive about that. Yeah.
The image of these stamps,
Mm-hmm.
you said that in the top was St. Petersburg, I believe, and then on the bottom there's an image of a village.
Mm-hmm.
But you said that doesn't represent the provinces. How
Yeah,
so?
that's a great question. So maybe I should ask Ann to come up too. But so the provinces are seen as a provincial town, a provincial city, and that's what we're really talking about oftentimes when we're talking about the provinces. Whereas the village is seen as something different, something separate. Now, the estate identity, the kind of district identity is somewhat different because the nobles at that time are trying to figure out how can we have an agrarian Russia that's a true Russia. It's very romantic. It's a very romantic proposal. But even there, they're not primarily centering it on the village itself. They're centering it on their own estate houses. And so you can think, and Kate has written about this, and you can think of the estate as a network of these estate houses, these nobles who are often related to each other, who would travel. This is oftentimes within an easy day's drive. They would exchange information. They would meet for holidays. And so for them, the district was this familial space. But it's not the same as the village either, right? So the village is this other world. It's a separate kind of world, a peasant world, and oftentimes the nobles are frustrated because they feel kind of shut out of the village, even though they own the village. They're not really part of it, and they can't always control it. And so, yes, the village is not really seen as the provinces. When we're thinking about the provinces, we're not thinking about the village. And the village becomes this kind of overarching kind of nowhere place that is at the same time deeply authentic. Just kind of curious.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question, and I think that the complicated answer you just gave to it it speaks to why this topic is so interesting, because you have these places that supposedly coexist, you know, that are in the same space and yet are almost like non-contiguous. Village, estate, province.
Yeah.
Right? And they're overlapping in these various ways, and yet they're not. They're very distinct, and sometimes even sort of not communicating with each other.
Yeah, if you can think of them as a series of networks that are networked to the things of their own, but not to each other, right? So the villages are networked to each other, the estate houses are networked to each other, the provincial town and the district towns are networked to each other, but they're not all inter-networked. So it's sort of like you've got 3 different overlays that are there, and you know, we do see this in fiction. As I said, you know, fiction is fiction, but at the same time, I've also read people writing about this in agricultural journals. Very few people have read agricultural journals, but there are real parallels between that and fiction, where they're attempting to influence their own village. Now that's a very weird thing to think about. They're attempting to own the village that they own, you know, to influence the village that they own. Curious, you know, but there is this sense of difficulty and always the sense of barrier, and some of them do it. I mean, the stories that one finds in the agricultural journals, they're so much more, generally speaking, upbeat than the ones one finds in Tolstoy, which I guess makes sense, right? But the ones that you find in the agricultural journals talk about how the peasants initially resisted, but then finally they did agree, and then they saw that they could make money too, and so they came along. Now there are other ones that say, well, I tried and I failed. So the literary trope of the failed experimenter does have basis in reality, but it's just one part of it. But of course, when you're writing a short story, it's a more interesting story, especially if you're Russian, than I tried it and I succeeded.
Right.
You know?
And there's also this sense that, you know, a third of 19th century Russian literature is noblemen saying, why won't my peasants do what I say?
Right, yeah.
You know? And in the same way that people write about their children and ask, like, why won't my children do what they say? You know, it's like, well, because they're humans and they're going to do what they actually want to do. But this then becomes a trope that takes on a life of its own.
Right.
But I had a question, just thinking about the way that the space gets represented with these different sort of non-communicating groups. I'm assuming that would be very different, like in the American Midwest, the same period, right? In other places, that same disconnect isn't happening to the same degree.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you wrote about that in the article in the Russian regional identities, where American space is gridded in a different way, where each grid is not worse than any other grid.
And like St. Louis could talk to a small town outside St. Louis or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had this kind of discussion with Russians about, well, what's the real capital of America? And I'm like, well, that's we don't really have an answer to that, because it's not. I mean, the political capital is Washington, D.C., and the artistic and financial and many other things capital is New York, and agricultural business capital is Chicago, and L.A. is the entertainment capital. And when I'm saying this, they're like, what are you talking about? That just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. But that is a reflection of regionalism, and a reflection of regionalism, federalism, democracy, and all these other things. Whereas if you have this very hierarchical system, as you do in Russia, it just makes a lot more sense. If you have an autocracy, there's one guy in charge, and then you have one capital, and then you know, this is kind of 2 capitals thing after Peter the Great. But you know, for example, New York was the capital of the United States for some time. Not a long time, still some time. But in the discourse about New York is never talking about, like, we used to be capital. We used to be capital. I mean, it's not even, it's sort of like the UN is here too. Nobody, unless people are talking about traffic, New York is not talking about the UN. Whereas, you know, St. Petersburg is always talking about how it used to be the capital. So the function of the capital is different in the two places, and also somebody mentioned that New York then did become financial capital and other sorts of capital, so it's losing the political capital in the sense of the physical place, was not the kind of huge thing that happened to St. Petersburg. But yes, there is a different, space is very influenced by politics, and politics also influence literature and all these sort of things. So there's multiple ways that the arrow of causation is going here. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the village again.
Uh-huh.
You said it was thought of as a nowhere place,
Mhm.
which is literally what utopia means.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if the nobles were influenced by Romanticism, if they viewed the village as this kind of utopia, do you think it bothered them that they were excluded from it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you see this even earlier than Romanticism. Bolotov, a fascinating, curious, encyclopedic writer of an 18th century Russia, he is influenced by this idea of the idyll, the place that's outside time, the pastoral, and he's trying to create these things in his village. But then you have serfdom, and that makes it really hard. And so a lot of his life, which involves, any dean would be very pleased with this guy. I mean, he really wrote and published like crazy. Well, I guess it was later that he published it, but in any case, he wrote. So he is trying to bring these things together. He's trying to create a kind of utopian place on his own estate, but serfdom is this kind of snake in the garden that keeps on coming up again and again. And so yes, there is this sense of being excluded. There's this sense of being excluded, and this is part of the reason why we have this great creation of Russian art and literature in the post-reform period, because the Russian nobility all of a sudden has lost its role between czar and people, and there's all of this attempt to figure out, well, what are we here for? What are we doing? Right? So we have Chekhov, who is talking about, showing the nobles, and they're sitting around and talking. They're searching for meaning. They don't really have meaning yet. And of course, again, this is fiction, but there is something traumatic about losing that connecting function and trying to find a new way to be in the world that makes sense within the whole, where the peasants are doing their own self-controlled, self-generated thing, and are not so interested in necessarily listening to what their former master has to say. Yeah. So it is very difficult. But it made great art, so that's good.
I think it's 4:30.
Okay.
So let's thank Susan